Welcome back to our lectures for ML103. This is The Poetic Life, Poetry and Music in Norse Culture and Digital Games. Now, as I mentioned on our course website, I've had a little bit of a change of plans. Instead of giving you the lecture on hoards and burials, which is a bit repetitive given what we already talked about with funeral practices, we're sticking to the 2 lectures this week, and I have posted in our playlist some examples of music and of clips from Assassin's Creed Valhalla in particular with regards to flighting that I'd like you to listen to as part of this lecture. And hopefully that will illustrate what I'm talking about as clearly as possible. All right, so we're going to begin by giving you a little bit of an overview of Norse poetry. And that, by the way, is the Codex Regius in that picture. For such an important book, it is not really all that spectacular looking. Now, there are many different types of Old Norse poetry. Some verse which is freestanding, so to speak, but a lot of times they're commemorating events, or they're poems of praise, or they're a medium for mythic or heroic tales. It's very likely that a lot of Old Norse poetry originally came from the earlier oral period. And we've touched on this before. This does not mean that they're transmitted in the same form, because oral literature is very different than written literature. It is more of a collection of formulae and scenes and language that is reassembled in new ways anytime it's performed by someone new. Writing it down means writing it into a single, unchanging form. So it's more like a poem that's based on the earlier oral literature rather than the same poem. Now, why do we think the chances are good that so much Old Norse poetry does in fact come from the oral versions originally? Well, part of it is because the structure and the rhyme schemes of this poetry are very complicated in a way that suggests they were meant to be remembered, not read from a written copy. To give you an example, the use of alliteration and other mnemonic devices is very common. So for instance, the combination of alliteration with the stressing of certain words really does suggest that at least some of this poetry was originally oral in nature. Now, the only thing we have to take into account there is that it also could have been done deliberately to make it sound like the original oral literature. It's very hard to say where the line would have been. I'll give you an example that's relevant here. It's not specifically poetry, but it's the same basic issue. So when I was in grad school, I was offered the opportunity to be a research assistant for a professor who was looking at an early printed version of a medieval medical manuscript. And we were supposed to be transcribing the printed book into electronic files so that it could be manipulated. The problem, of course, is it was a very early printed book. So the text had abbreviations and special symbols and stuff that you would only usually have seen in an actual handwritten manuscript. And the reason is that, this is what they were used to. This is what they thought a manuscript, even one produced by a printing press, should look like. So it's the same sort of thing with poetry. If they thought a poem should sound like this, even if it was a poem that was now written down, that the form didn't change, they're still going to sometimes make it sound like the original oral version. So again, it's hard to know where the line would be. Now, we have different major corpuses of poetry, of course. The saga corpus preserves poetry from the early period as reported speech of its protagonists. We have Eddic poetry from the prose and poetic Eddas. The prose Edda, by the way, the one that Snorri wrote, is basically a handbook for poets. It's divided into 3 sections. It covers genre, meter, talks about appropriate subject matter for different occasions, and quotes examples to support his points. So it's full of poems, either whole poems or fragments. We also have skaldic poetry that has information about mythology and traditional beliefs, as well as individual figures who are being praised or celebrated. The poetic Edda, as we've talked about before, is much more difficult to interpret and date. It is our primary source for Norse mythology. The Eddic poetry in particular does share a lot of similarities with Old English poetry, so they both clearly share a Germanic origin. We can date skaldic poetry in a lot of cases. Originally, the earliest versions were from the 9th and 10th century, but they continued to be produced until at least the 14th. But from about the late 10th century, most skalds, we believe, were Icelanders. So they had quite the tradition of poetry on that island. Now, the ability to create poetry was a highly prized one in the Viking Age. It's seen as a skill that any well-rounded person would be wise to master, especially if they wanted a leadership role. By the way, that image is a raven, I believe, sort of sucking up and letting drop the meat of poetry. Now we have a praise poem, a self-praise poem that was written by Ragnvald Kali, the Earl of Orkney. One of the lines has him bragging that, quote, "I know how to harp and how poems are made." The elite often composed verses in their own honor, or they acted as patrons for those who could do it for them. And the poetry was very often performed in the hall as an act of public praise. It's important to talk about the power of a hall's master in the hall itself in order to emphasize their accomplishments. There's a sort of symbolic aspect to this. In the hall, you're close to the hearth, the fire. It's warmth and light. Outside, it's dark. The hall is civilization, and poetry celebrates civilization. Outside is the night and chaos. A popular kind of imagery in Norse poetry was the kenning, which is basically a simile, where two or more nouns or descriptors are combined to evoke an object, either metaphorically or visually. So the ocean can be the whale road or the swan road. A ship can be a wave horse. Humans are sometimes seen as trees. They're trunks that support other things. So women could be trees of jewels in poetry. There is one particularly well-known type of skaldic poetry called the drapa. And this is from the Old Norse verb to strike, because the meter of the poem, its rhythm, suggests the striking of a stringed instrument. It's the most formal type of skaldic poetry, but we have to remember that not all skaldic poems were offered to lords. There are love poems, there are laments for lost family members, there are descriptions of somebody's cool new house, and the interior art inside, yes, really, and countless other examples of diverse subjects. So there's a lot of very interesting poetry in Old Norse. It's something that we could have looked into in much more depth. Now, what about music? What do we know about music in the Viking Age? Almost nothing. There's actually very little written music from the period in question anywhere in Europe. Even in the Carolingian Empire, you see only the beginnings of the development of notation. There's nothing at all from Scandinavia until much later. There are 12th century examples of the Mass, but there are no actual written examples of secular Scandinavian music until the 14th century. Now, what we do have are archaeological finds of musical instruments. So pan flutes made from cow's horns or the bones of sheep, hornpipes, which are similar to bagpipes but without the bag, stringed instruments, including the rebec, which you see in that picture there. It's vaguely like a violin, and of course the harp. Also something called the lure, which is a long sort of cone-shaped horn that's depicted in some contemporary art. And we know about the lure because it survived in a refined form as a folk instrument. Of course, we have many, many descriptions of musical performances in narrative texts like the sagas, which are full of them. Which also, raises the question, how much of the poetry that we have was actually sung? Ragnvald Kali, again, cited harp playing as one of his accomplishments, as did Harald Hardrada. Odin had been seeking the 9 holy songs in order to work his wonders. There are also plenty of stories of clever bards in the sagas. One gets cast into a snake pit, but plays his harp with his toes to put the snakes to sleep. Now, there is a sort of blurring of the line between music and magic in some texts. Saxo Grammaticus talks about a King Eric who was eventually driven berserk by the song of a visiting harper and wound up killing 4 men. There are other examples of that. Now, the attempt to reconstruct the music of the Viking Age has been ongoing since the Romantic movement. It began with a focus on trying to investigate the folk music of Scandinavia as its latter-day descendant. But more recently, groups have emerged that have been less about reconstruction and more about reimagination based on medieval Scandinavian culture. Heilung is one such group, although they also draw on other Germanic traditions from the Bronze and Iron Age. Their lyrics are usually about Norse themes. Now, in the playlist and the lecture recordings folder, I've given you a link to one of my favorite of their songs, In May John. It's longish, but do yourselves a favor, just cue it up. Even if you're doing something else while you listen to it. Then have some fun and read some of the comments. They're quite funny and entertaining. Wardruna is another musical group with a similar approach. Its lead singer, Einard Selvik, was deeply involved in creating the soundtrack to the Vikings TV series and was also a collaborator on the soundtrack of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. So I've given you another link, this one to a song called When Horns Resound, which comes from Valhalla, and it is sung in English. It is actually a song that is sung within the game itself at a very key moment when Eivor becomes Jarl, or Jarl Skona, towards the end of the game. And listen to it and think about all the little bits and pieces of Norse culture that you see in the lyrics. You know, the Einherjar, the Valkyrie, the ravens, all of that good stuff. Okay, I thought about talking about Skyrim, but we've already mentioned the Song of the Dragonborn, which is, one of the primary bardic things. And Skyrim's music is more generic, medievalist bard. Eivor, on the other hand, is a really interesting example of a Norse poet, because Eivor is constantly creating verse on the fly, usually at moments when he or she is inspired to do so, and generally gets approval from the other Norse around them when they do that. Ivar the Boneless, however, mocks them for doing it when they first meet. And one of the most notable uses of actual Norse poetry in the game is that Ivar is constantly quoting from the Havamal when they've just tripped out on mushrooms. This is the fly aspect challenges, as they're called. These are little puzzles where you come across usually stone circles of some sort. You eat the hallucinogenic mushrooms and then have to figure out an environmental puzzle or fight enemies. Now, by far, however, the most interesting implementation of the Norse love for poetry in this game are the flighting competitions. So flighting, or senna, are verbal battles where you insult an opponent in the most clever way you can manage in verse. And we see this preserved in literature like the Lokasenna, which we're going to talk about at the Zoom session. And it also shows up in things like the poem about the Battle of Malden, which is really interesting, where Saxon Lord Bertnoth is flighting with a Viking. And they go sort of all into it in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, because it's actually a game mechanic. It allows you to develop Eivor's charisma. If you do this, you get additional options in dialogue. So if you have a high enough charisma, you can talk people into things without having to pay them or fight them if you want something from them. Now, the final link that I've given you in the playlist is a compilation of all of the flighting matches from the game, or most of the flighting matches from the game. Watch as much as you'd like. Note that they're not all mean-spirited. Sometimes they're just very playful. Do they function as character development as well as mechanic? It's an interesting question. And the thing that tickles me is that a lot of the critics that talk about the use of flighting in this game call them Viking Age rap battles. And maybe you'd just like to think a little bit about why that is, what the commonalities are there. All right, so make sure that you watch the supplemental material, and otherwise have a good rest of the weekend. I will see you at the Zoom session. Thanks very much, guys.